I look okay?
Something's missing.
You know the moment, the red dress at the opera, the quiet way Edward Lewis lifts Vivian Ward's chin, and for the first time, she sees the possibility of truly being seen and valued. Back when romance films were not something to watch ironically, but something you and your girlfriends planned an entire evening around. It was a time of sharing tissues in the dark and believing a little more in yourselves because a story told you that you mattered. Pretty Woman became a mirror for every woman who felt underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. Behind the camera, a 21-year-old Julia Roberts was carrying the enormous pressure of a major film. She was trembling under expectations she couldn't yet name. Director Gary Marshall and co-star Richard Gere created a zone of care around her. They proved that real tenderness, not just performance, was required to build something that truly comforts the soul. If this movie still makes you cry, still reminds you of who you were, it is because real, protective care built it. Here are 25 documented emotional truths behind Pretty Woman. Factor 1. Julia Roberts trembled before major scenes, and Gary Marshall held her hands until she calmed. Crew members repeatedly confirmed that Julia Roberts shook visibly before key scenes. She struggled with the pressure of carrying a major studio film at age 21. Director Gary Marshall often stopped shooting to sit with her, holding her hands while she breathed through the anxiety. This wasn't tough love direction, it was emotional protection. Marshall later explained she was a kid, a brilliant one. She needed calm, not pressure. When you feel overwhelmed, sometimes the gentlest hand is exactly what you need. Fact number 2. Julia broke out in stress hives. So severe, they had to halt production. Gary Marshall revealed in multiple interview commentaries that Julia developed stress hives from anxiety before big emotional scenes. Makeup artists confirmed they often had to cover sudden redness around her chest and neck. The pressure of sudden fame and the expectations of the role were collapsing on her young shoulders. Rather than pushing her to keep filming, Marshall stopped the entire production, cleared the set, and waited with her until she was composed enough to continue. For women who remember being young and overwhelmed by life's demands, that act of gentleness feels deeply familiar and validating. Fact number 3. The famous laughing on the bed moment was Julia releasing real tension, not acting. The moment where Vivian bursts into relieved laughter on the bed was entirely unscripted. Richard Gere noticed Julia's anxiety and improvised a joke to deliberately ease her tension, causing her to collapse into genuine, relieved laughter. Marshall immediately recognized the authenticity of the release and kept the take. What connected deeply with women watching wasn't just comedy. It was the raw vulnerability of a young woman finally getting permission to breathe. Fact number 4. Julia had a quiet breakdown during the bathtub scene and cried in front of the crew. The iconic bubble bath scene looks playful, but the reality behind it was raw. According to crew interviews, Julia Roberts felt exposed and overwhelmed, struggling with a male-dominated crew and her own self-consciousness. She started crying quietly in the tub until the water cooled around her. Gary Marshall instantly cleared the set, sat beside her, and talked her through her shaky breathing. This was more than directing. It was a profound act of caretaking, acknowledging that sometimes a young woman just needs a safe space to fall apart. Fact number 5. Richard Gere refused the role. Until Julia Roberts slipped him a handwritten note, Richard Gere initially wasn't interested in starring in a romantic comedy and said no to the role. But when he met Julia, she took a Post-it note, wrote "Please say yes" on it, and slid it across the table to him. Richard saw how nervous she was and how much she genuinely wanted someone steady beside her. He looked up, smiled, and said, "I just said yes." He later implied the commitment was for her, not for the movie itself. Fact number 6. The necklace box, Snap, was improvised to cheer Julia up after a stressful morning. Julia was visibly tense and struggling during the filming of the famous necklace scene. Richard Gere noticed this, and during one take, he mischievously snapped the jewelry case shut on her fingers. It was a gentle, protective attempt to lighten her mood. Julia's subsequent laughter was real, pure, and unfiltered, and Marshall kept it because it captured the bright, spontaneous spirit that existed underneath her nerves. Fact number 7. Julia suffered a panic attack. During the poster photo shoot, and the female crew physically helped her, photographer Herb Ritz and Gary Marshall confirmed that Julia had a panic attack during the iconic back-to-back poster shoot. She became dizzy and hyperventilated. Marshall cleared the room and held her shoulders, but the emotional protection came from the female team. Hairstylists rubbed her back, and makeup artists cooled her forehead. The world saw effortless glamour, but what truly happened behind the lens was a quiet act of sisterhood and tender support. Fact number 8. The intimate chemistry between Julia and Richard came from protective softness, not flirtation. Both actors have repeatedly stated that there was no romance or secret crush between them. Their powerful on-screen connection came from something deeper. Richard slowing down scenes to match Julia's trembling energy, giving her space to settle her nerves. Crew members noted that he treated her with protective stillness, never dominating or pressuring her. That profound respect is why their chemistry feels safe and enduring, not simply performative. Fact number 9. Julia privately grieved the loss of anonymity and cried off camera many nights. Later interviews revealed how deeply Julia Roberts struggled emotionally with the sudden intense spotlight of fame at only 21. Paparazzi swarmed her, and she cried alone at night, unsure if she deserved the success and afraid it would swallow her whole. Gary Marshall noticed her red eyes on set and adjusted shoot schedules to give her necessary breathers. He assigned trusted crew members to stay near her so she didn't feel overwhelmed. For many women watching in 1990, juggling their own jobs, children, and expectations, this mirrored their own invisible, emotional battles. Fact 10. Richard Gere shielded Julia from intrusive camera angles during intimate scenes. Crew members confirmed that Richard Gere often strategically repositioned himself to block certain camera lines during the intimate moments of the film. He did this quietly, without announcing his intention, focusing only on ensuring that Julia felt protected. It wasn't about the performance, it was about dignity. Julia later said that Richard was a gentleman in every sense, confirming that their profound on-screen trust was built on these small, quiet acts of care. Fact 11. Julia's tears during the opera scene were real. The music overwhelmed her emotionally. Julia Roberts had never actually seen a live opera up close before filming. During the scene, she was so profoundly moved by the emotional power of the music that she genuinely teared up between takes. Marshall confirmed that he captured and kept some of those real tears in the final film. Women who watch this movie, who have felt deeply moved by unexpected beauty they couldn't explain, immediately recognize the authenticity and the permission to feel in her expression. Fact number 12. Julia cried, reading the original dark script, prompting Marshall to soften the entire film. The original script, titled 3000, ended with Vivian being abandoned, a much darker conclusion than the final version. Julia cried when she read this ending, telling interviewers that it broke her emotionally. When Gary Marshall took over the project, he changed the narrative to one centered on dignity, hope, and emotional integrity. He didn't just rewrite a movie. He reshaped the entire emotional burden to protect the vulnerable young actress at its center. Fact number 13. Julia turned to Gary Marshall's wife, Barbara, for quiet emotional reassurance. Barbara Marshall, the director's wife, often spent time on the set, creating a calming, familiar presence. Julia frequently slipped away from the set pressures to sit with her, finding quiet comfort in her non-judgmental stability. Julia later shared that Barbara made her feel seen, not judged, a powerful example of female solidarity working in real time to steady a young woman in crisis. Fact number 14. Richard Gere's live piano playing soothed Julia during a difficult evening shoot. The piano music that Edward Lewis plays in the hotel lounge was actually performed live by Richard Gere himself. On that particular evening, Julia was exhausted and anxious. When Gere began playing, the atmosphere in the entire room softened, affecting the crew as well. Marshall observed that Julia's serene expression in the scene was not acting. The music genuinely brought her peace. Women watching this scene instinctively feel that quiet, healing intimacy of a good man creating emotional safety. Fact 15. Julia's tears in the final balcony scene were genuine emotional exhaustion, not acting. By the final balcony shoot, Julia Roberts was completely depleted and woke up that morning sick with nerves. She confessed to Marshall and Gere that she feared she had nothing left to give. When Richard delivered his lines softly, avoiding any melodrama, Julia cried real tears. She wasn't just Vivian being rescued, she was Julia, who had survived pressure, panic, and the enormous emotional cost of carrying the movie. Marshall kept the take because it honored the truth. She wasn't performing hope, she was sincerely clinging to it. Fact, Fertrand 16. Costume designer Marilyn Vance became Julia's emotional protector and steadying force. Marilyn Vance, who designed the iconic red gown and other famous looks, quickly sensed Julia's deep-seated insecurities. Vance would often adjust Julia's costume slowly and gently, whispering private encouragements to her. Julia has credited Marilyn as one of the few people who could physically pull me back when I started to drift emotionally. This is the quiet, essential power of female support in a high-pressure environment. Fact 17. Julia nearly quit, and Richard quietly visited her home with Marshall to steady her resolve. During the early rehearsals, the sheer weight of the role and the pressure became so intense that Julia considered quitting the film entirely. Director Gary Marshall confirmed this was a real crisis. Richard Gere, along with Marshall, went to her home, sat with her, and told her simply, "We want you, I want you." There was no pressure or guilt, just a simple, grounding presence. Julia later said that this moment, built entirely on respect and presence, was what restored her confidence to continue. Fact 18. Julia's real fear of abandonment shaped Vivian's smallest, most vulnerable gestures. Years later, Julia confessed that she had deep personal fears of not being enough and of being left behind. Marshall subtly wrote small emotional beats into the script where Vivian momentarily looks away or deflates slightly when Edward is distant. These were emotional fingerprints of Julia's own real-life insecurities woven into the character. Women watching in 1990 immediately recognized these small, painful moments because they lived them too, validating their own unseen struggles. Factor 19. The Rodeo Drive boutique scene was born from Julia's real-life experiences of being dismissed. Julia confided in Gary Marshall about her experiences of being belittled and dismissed by certain judgmental Hollywood people. Marshall encouraged her to channel those genuine emotional wounds and the desire for justice into the iconic Rodeo Drive boutique scene. The visible pain and sudden defiance in her eyes during that scene wasn't solely character acting, it was memory. For millions of women, that powerful scene felt like a moment of collective justice for all the times they had been casually underestimated. Fact number 20. Richard checked on Julia regularly after filming to ensure fame wasn't overwhelming her. Following the film's massive success, Richard Gere immediately recognized how intense the spotlight became for his young co-star. He continued to call her regularly, checking in and making sure she wasn't swallowed whole by the sudden, overwhelming wave of fame. Julia spoke openly about how this sustained, quiet care meant more than anyone outside their circle could realize. Their enduring, supportive friendship, which was always clearly platonic, was a crucial force that kept her emotionally steady during those turbulent years. Fact 21. Gary Marshall deliberately built a safe set because he feared Hollywood would emotionally harm Julia. Marshall openly said he structured the set to prioritize Julia's emotional protection, patient schedules, a warm crew environment, and a slower pacing than typical Hollywood productions. He clearly knew she was brilliant but fragile. His primary goal was for her to feel safe, not overwhelmed by the creative process. Julia later reflected that it was one of the few sets in her early career where she felt completely sheltered, a testament to a director using his power for kindness. Fact number 22. Julia trusted the female hair and makeup team. More than anyone else, they became her emotional circle. Members of the female hair and makeup team confirmed that Julia often confided in them during quiet breaks between takes. They would brush her hair slowly when she was visibly anxious, gently adjust her makeup when she cried off camera, and consistently reminded her that she was enough. It was a small, powerful circle of women quietly keeping another woman afloat amidst massive industry pressure. Fact Chakra 23. Julia had to take grounding breaks during filming because her heart raced uncontrollably from anxiety. Julia has acknowledged that her intense anxiety frequently manifested physically on set. Her heart would race, her chest would tighten, and she would suffer sudden breathlessness. Gary Marshall proactively built unscheduled recenter breaks into the filming days just so she could step away and regain control of her body. Women who have ever had to hold themselves together and function during impossible, anxious seasons understand exactly the invisible emotional battle Julia was fighting through. Fact Number 24. The emotional warmth of the hotel staff scenes came from Julia bonding with the actors off camera. Actors like Hector Elizondo, who played the fatherly hotel manager, have shared that Julia spent significant time talking with them between takes. She found comfort and stability in their calm, mature presence. Elizondo encouraged her, joked gently with her, and served as a grounding force against the chaos of her sudden fame. Their real, quiet warmth and connection shaped the authenticity of every scene they shared on screen. Fact 25. Julia later said Pretty Woman saved her sense of worth, not just her career. Years after the film became a legendary success, Julia admitted that Pretty Woman gave her something far deeper than stardom. It helped her genuinely believe that she mattered. She stated that the documented kindness she received from Richard Gere, Marshall, Marilyn Vance, Barbara Marshall, and the female crew members kept me standing. She learned on that set that she didn't have to be perfect. She only had to be human. For the millions of women who watched the film in 1990 while juggling their own heartbreaks and hopes, that profound truth remains the film's lasting, most important legacy. Pretty Woman endures not because of its fairy tale veneer, but because of the deep humanity layered beneath it. The story of a young woman trembling under impossible pressure, of older women stepping up to steady her, of a male co-star using his influence with quiet protection, of a director shaping an emotional shelter around someone who desperately needed it. The warmth you feel in the film was never accidental. It was painstakingly built on compassion. Back when romance films unapologetically affirmed that hope was possible, Pretty Woman reminded women that softness was never weakness and that hope wasn't naive. If you still tear up when Vivian cries in the opera box or when Edward climbs the fire escape, you're not simply being sentimental. You are responding to the real, lived vulnerability that was layered into every frame. For the generation of women who watched this film with friends who felt like sisters, and who may have lost or drifted from those friendships, the movie still carries those cherished memories. Pretty Woman didn't just tell a story. It held a generation of women gently, just as the cast and crew held Julia, and it continues to do so today.